Hey everybody, Ian here. I know the world of politics is very crazy today, and so probably a lot of people, regardless of where they fall on the political spectrum, are wondering how exactly we got here. You know, the election of Donald Trump. And so my hope is to be able to at least partially answer that question using everyone's favorite method, a dry discussion of the history of electoral politics in the United States. A lot of people point to, they like to point to various recent occurrences, like, you know, the election of Trump, the election of Obama, 9/11, and say like, oh, this is where everything started to go wrong. But honestly, things have been going wrong for a very long time. and so I think if you really want to understand the place we're in right now, it's helpful to take a look backwards. I once read a quote that said, life can only be understood looking backwards, but it can only be lived looking forwards. And so in an effort to allow us to more easily live in our mess of a world, we need to first take a look backwards to understand our mess of a world. So anyway, let's just get started. Before I can talk about Democrats in the 1930s, though, I'm going to talk somewhat briefly about the two parties pre and post Civil War. The Democratic Party was founded in 1828, and it was founded on the principles of a weak federal government, strong adherence to states' rights, and serving rural interests, especially southern plantation owners. And so, as any conservative on Twitter will be happy to point out, the Democratic Party was very much the party of slavery during these early years. They were the party of the plantation owners. But the main opposition to the Democratic Party for the first 30 or so years of its life was the Whig Party. And the Whigs fell apart in the 1850s over the issue of slavery. And from its ashes rose the Republican Party. And the Republicans lost in 1856, but they won in 1860 with Abraham Lincoln, at which point all the Southern Confederate states just took their ball and went home. The simple version of this is that the GOP, the Republican Party, was just anti-slavery and the Democrats were pro-slavery. Good versus bad. And the truth is, I think it's a lot more complicated than that, or at least somewhat more complicated. There were very few Republicans who opposed slavery out of the goodness of their hearts. Everyone was very racist back then, including the Republican Party, as is everyone now. Everyone's racist. But Abraham Lincoln, he actually ran on a platform of stopping the expansion of slavery. All he wanted was for any new states that came into the Union, because we were getting new states all the time. Any new states wouldn't be allowed to have slavery as an option, but states that already had it can keep it. But the thing is, the North, the reason they didn't use slaves, again, it was not out of the goodness of their hearts, is because they didn't have the type of fertile soil to allow for it. The ground is a lot harder in New England, and plus New England winters are awful. And so the North is where more businesses and corporations were, office buildings and stuff, compared to the plantations and the farmland of the South. But so a lot of people in the North, particularly business owners, they didn't want to have to compete economically against slavery because, up in the North, they're paying their workers like some kind of chump. Not really. I do not endorse slavery. But the thing is, at this point in time, almost all black people lived in the South, because they were violently forced to do so. But since Northerners were far away from all the black people, in their office buildings, as well as their unsanitary factory floors where they worked for starvation wages to pay for their unventilated housing in overcrowded tenements, because there was no minimum wage or safety standards at this point, but we'll get to that later. It was very easy for people in the North to talk vaguely about the idea of freeing the slaves and not have to think about, what to do with all these black people afterwards, because remember that everyone, all white people, were and are racist. But so after the Civil War ended, the Confederate states, they were allowed to rejoin the Union on the condition that they ratify the 14th Amendment, which is the amendment that gave citizenship to anyone born in the United States, including former slaves. But after the Civil War ended, the issue of slavery abolishment was no longer relevant. The slaves were freed. And so the Republican Party turned its sights elsewhere. And during the 1870s, the Republican Party, it became a party that was more concerned with corporate interests. remember, the North is where all the businesses were, and the North voted for Lincoln. The North, the Republican Party was very much the party of the North. It's very different from today. But Democrats, meanwhile, they remained a party of rural interests. Democrats were still very bitter about the war and Reconstruction, and so the South stayed very solidly Democratic for decades after this. And for a long time, the South was actually called the Solid South because it so reliably voted Democratic. And Southern Democrats also routinely, violently terrorized Black Americans and took any chance they got to persecute them and cut them off from the rest of society. But I talk more about that in my racism video. Feel free to check that out. But the post-war era, this was very much a time of Republican domination. From 1860 to 1908, there were 13 elections, and the Republicans won 11 of these, 11 of the 13 elections. Democrats only won in 1884 and 1892, with Grover Cleveland winning both of those elections. He's actually the only president to serve non-consecutive terms. He was elected the first time in 1884, and then barely lost re-election in 1888. So he ran again in 1892, and won against the guy who had barely beaten him 4 years earlier. But the thing is, these late 1800s years, these were very bad times for American workers. This was at the height of the Industrial Revolution, and so there were constantly lots of gains in terms of machinery and efficiency of output of products. But there were no safety standards and no minimum wage, no labor laws. There were no child labor restrictions, and I mean, they didn't even have things as basic as like fire exits. And on top of this, they had very bad housing situations, lots of overcrowding, lots of disease, and no ventilation in these houses, in these tenements, which are, the short version is that they're like apartment buildings. And the reason that these standards didn't exist is because for a long time they hadn't needed them. In like, an artisan leather shop, for example, in 1750, if there's, if there's just 2 or 3 workers, if there's a fire in the building, in the shop, the 3 employees just leave. But so it was uncharted territory to have these factories of, 150, 250, maybe even 400 workers. And so they had to learn the hard way that stuff like fire exits are necessary. But on top of this lack of protections, and safety standards, there were also no laws against monopolies and unfair pricing. And so corporations during this time, it's called the Gilded Age, but corporations during this time acted very much outside the interests of consumers and workers. They just did whatever was necessary to make a profit. Things have totally changed now. But so at this time, citizens were very intrigued by progressive ideas of reform. And so in 1896, there was an election between a Republican, William McKinley, and a populist Democratic candidate named William Jennings Bryan. And McKinley, the Republican, ultimately won this election, but Bryan, he made enormous gains all throughout the Midwest, which had previously been Republican territory. And that was because of his populist agenda. And so 4 years later, in 1900, there was another election, and the exact same 2 candidates actually got nominated. It was a rematch. But President McKinley, incumbent President McKinley, he threw progressives a bone by nominating Teddy Roosevelt, who was a hardcore progressive reformist, as his vice president. And once again in this election, McKinley beat William Jennings Bryan, so he's 0-2 now. But the thing is, McKinley, he was assassinated like 6 months into his second term, and leaving Teddy Roosevelt as president. And as president, Teddy Roosevelt instituted tons and tons of populist, progressive reforms that were designed to address all sorts of issues that had been brought forward over the past, 30 or 40 years. And the Teddy Roosevelt administration is definitely it's absolutely the beginning of what is called the progressive era in the United States. It's a chunk of time in the early 1900s. I don't really have time to get into the specifics of this, but Teddy Roosevelt was a fantastic president. Absolutely not without his drawbacks, but he moved the country light years ahead in terms of domestic policy and consumer and worker protections. And so he was reelected in 1904. He was very popular, and he served out his term. Despite he was actually shot at one point, but survived and kept giving his speech. Total badass. When he was finishing up, he chose a guy named William Howard Taft to succeed him for the Republican nomination. And Taft got the Republican nomination and then was elected president in 1908 over the now 3-time nominee William Jennings Bryan. Oh my gosh, that poor guy. And once again, I don't have time for the specifics, but Taft was very much a pussy compared to Teddy Roosevelt. Just think of him as way watered down Teddy Roosevelt. And so Taft ran for re-election in 1912, but Teddy Roosevelt, who had been very unhappy with Taft's performance as president, he ran as a third party, splitting the Republican vote and allowing Democrat Woodrow Wilson to prevail. And an interesting thing about this election was that Teddy Roosevelt actually came in second place behind Woodrow Wilson, ahead of the incumbent president Taft. And Taft actually set the record for the worst performance by an incumbent president in any election ever, getting only 23% of the popular vote, and oh my God, 8 electoral votes. Very embarrassing. But Wilson, he continued a lot of the progressive reforms of the progressive era, and he was reelected in 1916. He was a pretty popular president. But he was also president during World War I. And the U.S. involvement in World War I was very chaotic, but I'll talk more about that later. After World War I ended, Americans were tired. They had basically 2 decades of massive political and socioeconomic reforms, and then there was this giant world war. And so they were just, like I said, tired. This all just tuckered them out. And so the U.S. retreated into isolationism for the next 10 years, fully absolving themselves of responsibility with anything to do with global affairs. And so during the 1920s, they elected 3 more Republican presidents in 1920, 1924, and 1928, all of which were massive landslides. I mentioned earlier how Democrats, they only won 2 of 13 elections between 1860 and 1928. But if you extend that window just a little bit further, between 1860 and 1928, there had been 18 elections, and Democrats only won 4 of them. And so if you think about it, between 1860 and 1928, there were only 2 Democratic presidents, Grover Cleveland and Woodrow Wilson. But then in October of 1929, the stock market cratered, which marked the beginning of the Great Depression, which changed everything. And so with this, I have now reached the actual focus of this video, the 1930s and onward. But, sorry, need a drink. Since Republicans had been in power at the beginning of the Great Depression, and for the entire decade leading up to it, voters very much viewed them as responsible for this crisis. And it really was a crisis. I mean, unemployment hit 25%, meaning 1 in 4 Americans did not have a job. And thousands of banks across the country closed their doors because they had no money. And since banks acted without guarantee at that time, because there were far fewer regulations in place designed to protect consumers, people just lost all their money when the banks closed. But the thing is, a lot of these banks closed because people were scared of losing all their money, and so they would do what's called a run on the banks, which is when everyone runs to the bank and takes out all of their money because they're afraid it will close. But since they take out all their money, this forces the bank to close, which sets off a spiral. But anyway, in President Hoover, who had been elected in 1928 in a landslide, he took a hands-off approach to the Great Depression. He favored less government intervention over more. And voters were not happy with this approach. And they voted overwhelmingly for Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, in 1932. And as president, FDR followed in the footsteps of the other President Roosevelt and instituted enormous social and political reforms known as the New Deal. But he was able to even a larger extent than Teddy had been able to, because of the magnitude of the crisis that the country was facing. But as part of the New Deal, he passed social reforms for the poor, designed to give them a safety net, basically. which ultimately came to be Social Security later in his administration, massive government work projects for the unemployed so that people could, have a job and earn money, measures that were designed to stabilize American crop prices and help modernize farming methods, since farmers at this point made up a very, very large chunk of the American population. And also huge infrastructure projects like building roads and bridges and hydroelectric dams even. And this was all just in the first 100 days of his residency, like the first 3 months. And all presidents are now judged by what they accomplish in their first 100 days because of the enormous productivity of FDR's first 100 days. But with FDR and the New Deal, the Democratic Party became the party of government, which at the time was very much seen as an asset because the Great Depression was so bad. The Great Depression was so bad, you guys. How bad was it? So bad. But so in 1936, FDR was reelected by an even larger margin than he had been in 32. And he continued to institute these popular New Deal reforms. But these hit a wall in the late 1930s, however, as a wave of conservatives were elected to Congress who stymied a lot of the progress. But then in 1939, World War II officially begun when Germany invaded Poland. And then so in 1940, just the next year, FDR ran for an unprecedented third term, citing trouble in Europe. And he and the New Deal programs, they were still very popular, and so voters reelected him by a pretty wide margin. And voters also, they thought it best not to switch leaders in the midst of dual crises. However, this was aided by FDR being a very competent individual, which cannot be said of the current leader overseeing multiple crises. But FDR, even though he was comfortably reelected, he was elected by a smaller margin than in 1932 or in 36 against a guy named Thomas Dewey. And despite reelecting him, voters were still very much against going to war. They had been staunchly isolationist since the end of World War I. But so the U.S. began just building weapons for the Allied forces, which actually, it lowered the unemployment rates pretty substantially. But it did not, the U.S. didn't enter into the war until the end of 1941 when the attack on Pearl Harbor happened in Hawaii. At which point all these isolationist voters were like, oh no, war is the right answer. But so at this point, the U.S. fully entered the war, which ended the Great Depression in like a heartbeat. And by the way, the Great Depression had begun like 12 years before this. The Great Depression was really bad and really long. But the unemployment rate snapped down from 12% down to 2% in like a month because everybody got a job. But World War II is actually, it's a very weird time for me to think about, just because that was the last point in time when people had to check the paper every day just to make sure that, this crazy guy hadn't taken over the world yet. We haven't really gotten that level of like excitement in a long time. I'm not complaining about that, but just, observing. It's also weird to think that there used to be a time when, before World War II really got going, when it was totally normal and even like appropriate to ask like, oh, hey, have you heard of this Hitler guy? Like, huh, wow. But so anyway, the U.S. had a very efficient entry into the war, much more so than when entering World War I. And the reason for this is because when the U.S. made weapons and war materials back during World War I, it was very messy. Basically what happened is in World War I is that the U.S. told all these factories, we need planes and propellers and, tanks and guns, but then they let them figure out for themselves how exactly to delegate the items that needed to be built. In World War II, however, the federal government gave very direct commands. They said, you guys are going to build planes. You guys are going to build tanks. You guys are going to make guns. And also, all U.S. output went toward making weapons during World War II. Everything else stopped. There were no toys or appliances or anything like that. Everything was for war. So since everyone had a job, but there was literally nothing to spend money on, literally nothing, people started saving up pretty vast sums over the next several years. Personally, I view the response to the coronavirus to be very much like the response to World War I. Woodrow Wilson was not the oh my gosh, the laughably incompetent narcissist that Donald Trump is. But the responses to both, they needed to be more centralized and more clear. And personally, I think that climate change is going to be our World War II. It is just around the corner. And my hope is that we can learn from what we did wrong during the COVID response when it comes to forming climate change policy, because it really is 10 years away, and we have no idea how big and how bad it's going to be. But because of World War II continuing, FDR ran for a truly unprecedented fourth term in 1944 and won, but by his smallest margin yet, although he still won by double digits. But he beat the same guy from 1940, that Thomas Dewey again. However, FDR died just a couple months into his fourth term, leaving Harry Truman as president. And Truman, he finished the war, and he set out to make the U.S. a solid presence in global affairs from that point going forward, because the lack of U.S. involvement after World War I is actually a big part of why World War II ended up happening. And for this generation of people who had seen two world wars within 25 years of each other, said, like, this can't happen again. But following World War II, there was actually a very brief but very sharp economic downturn. As all these factories had been making nothing but war materials for the past 4 years, suddenly had nothing to make. But after 6 months or so, consumer spending and high demand caused the economy to take off in a full sprint that it kept up for nearly 30 years. But at this point, the 1948 election was in sight, with Truman being the Democratic nominee, obviously. And Thomas Dewey, the same guy who had lost 2 times before to FDR, becoming the Republican nominee for the 3rd time. And Truman was widely expected to lose the election. In fact, it was such a given that newspapers even printed issues declaring Dewey defeats Truman before the polls were even closed. However, because of some feisty campaigning on Truman's part, Truman was actually able to overcome a pretty sizable polling deficit and won over Dewey, who lost for the 3rd time in a row. I feel like he and William Jennings Bryan should be friends. I really feel like both of them in their 3rd try, they were like, oh, this is the year. I'll win this time. Little did they know. But so anyway, at this point, Republicans took a long look in the mirror. They had lost 5 of the last 5 elections, one of which seemed extremely winnable just 4 months before it. FDR and the New Deal had always been immensely popular, which is why Republican attacks against it during the 1930s and 40s just weren't able to stick. And so for the next election in 1952, they brought themselves closer to what was now the political center and nominated a guy named Dwight D. Eisenhower, Ike Eisenhower, who was the general who had basically won World War II. But Eisenhower ran on a platform that was relatively liberal for a Republican. He supported lots of aspects of the New Deal, including Social Security, and also was, again, the general who won World War II. But so he was elected in 1952 and re-elected in 1956 by pretty large margins. The 1950s, though, this was when civil rights began to become a more prominent issue, with lots of developments on that front during the 1950s and 60s. And it was because of the issue of civil rights that Democrats began to have some problems. If you remember, the Democratic Party was the party of slavery. And if you remember, the South, used to be called the Solid South because it so reliably voted Democratic. But the New Deal and FDR himself, they brought in a lot of new people to this expanding Democratic tent, including black people and liberal Northerners. And so when these newcomers to the party wanted to make changes, they were met with pretty substantial resistance from these conservative Southerners who had been Democratic going back generations. But at the 1948 Democratic Convention, Southern delegates they staged a walkout of the convention because of then President Truman's stance on civil rights. They called themselves the Dixiecrats. They were conservative Southern Democrats, and they literally walked out of the convention and didn't come back. And so even though Truman went on to win in 1948, that was really when the cracks of the Democratic Party's foundation really started to show. Regardless, the South continued it remained solidly in the Democratic Party's corner, for another decade, probably in part because Eisenhower, a Republican, was president during the 1950s, and he was making several pushes towards civil rights. And it's always easier to be the party out of power. It wasn't until the 1960s when electoral politics really started to get rocky for the Democrats. And oh my gosh, I feel like for anyone who's not into politics, that's probably the most boring sentence ever. You know, oh yeah, 1960, that's when things got really interesting in terms of electoral politics. But anyway, in 1960, Democratic candidate John F. Kennedy, JFK, who included various civil rights reforms in his platform, was elected president over the incumbent Vice President Richard Nixon, who just did not have the charisma of Eisenhower or Kennedy. JFK won a number of these southern states like Texas and Louisiana and Georgia, Arkansas and others. But however, he lost Mississippi and half of the electoral votes of Alabama to a conservative southern senator named Harry Byrd. And additionally, his margins in the South were substantially lower than the enormous landslides that Democrats were used to in the South. For example, in 1936, at the when FDR won by his largest margin nationwide, he won 98% of the vote in South Carolina. In 1936, a Democrat won 98% of the vote in South Carolina, and you can compare that to 1960 when a Democrat, JFK, won 51% of the vote in South Carolina. He won the state by just under 3 points. And you can compare that to 2016, when Republican candidate Trump won 55% of the vote in South Carolina, beating Hillary Clinton by 15%. And so something clearly changed during this time. After Kennedy was killed, though, in 1963, the U.S. went from our hottest president to one of our ugliest, with Vice President Lyndon Johnson being sworn into office. And Kennedy's youth was always viewed very symbolically through the eyes of Americans. He was seen as a fresh start of sorts. And so his death, similarly, was viewed symbolically, with many Americans feeling like it represented lost opportunities and squandered potential. And so in 1964, the 1964 election the next year, Johnson, Kennedy's vice president, he campaigned very heavily on fulfilling the wishes of the young, slain President JFK, who had always been very popular. His approval rating was around 80% when he got killed. And so he pushed very hard for the Civil Rights Act, which he passed before the election in 1964, as well as the Voting Rights Act, which he passed in 1965. But this approach, bringing in the dead popular young president, this approach really resonated with Americans, and combined with the very far right conservatism of Republican nominee Barry Goldwater, this gave Johnson a landslide victory. He actually got the highest percentage of the popular vote that's ever been recorded, before or after. It was just under 62%. Barry Goldwater, the Republican nominee, he was very, very conservative for his time. He's an interesting case study, though. He is someone who very truly and very consistently believed that the government should not interfere in people's lives. He was an adamant supporter of states' rights. And so he opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Act. But I believe that it was truly on the grounds of states' rights. But the thing is, he also, he supported abortion rights, even though that's something he didn't frequently discuss in his lifetime, but he felt that it was not the government's business to interfere in people's lives. I very much view him as being similar to like Ron Swanson. If you watch like Parks and Recreation, he just does not want the government involved. But the thing is, his opposition to the Civil Rights Act, which again, I really truly believe that Barry Goldwater specifically, his opposition was rooted in a desire for states' rights. But his opposition to the Civil Rights Act made it really easy for all the racist Democrats in the South to yell, yeah, states' rights, man, and vote against the Civil Rights Act. And so even though Johnson won in a landslide over Barry Goldwater in 1964, he actually became the first Democrat to lose the South. The entire Deep South voted for the candidate who opposed the Civil Rights Act, and thus the solid South was gone. Civil rights continued to be a massive issue as the 1960s wore on, but it also began to be overshadowed by the Vietnam War. And as it became apparent that the U.S. was losing this war, President Johnson's strategy was basically to just double down, just send more troops and drop more bombs. And the war massively eroded Johnson's popularity. And in 1968, he announced that he would not run for re-election. And this was not long after the primaries for the 1968 election. In one of the first primary states, New Hampshire, Johnson's competitor got 30% of the vote against an incumbent president. That is unheard of. And so Johnson announced that he wouldn't run. But so the 1968 election, it ended up being just an enormous mess for everyone involved. The incumbent president declined to run again, and various candidates were shot and even killed. There were massive civil rights protests all over the country, and the Democratic Convention that year actually ended up being becoming a televised brawl between the Chicago police and a bunch of hippies, basically. But in response to all this messiness, Republican Richard Nixon won by a very small margin, having lost to JFK 8 years earlier by an even smaller margin. But in 1968, the South voted for a guy named George Wallace, who I talk about in my racism video, so I'm not going to discuss him now. But so Democrats had a fairly good run till this point. Of the 9 elections between 1932 and 1964, Democrats won 7 times. The only times they lost were when they were up against the guy who, again, literally won World War II. But little did Democrats know, as of 1968, this era was over. In 1972, Richard Nixon was running for re-election, and he was up by like 20% in all the polls. Everyone knew that this was not going to be a close election. And that year, Democrats nominated a guy named George McGovern. And you've probably never heard of him, and there is a reason for that. That's right. McGovern lost every single state except for Massachusetts. And by the way, the website I'm using for these maps, they have election maps for every U.S. presidential election, but they also have margin of victory maps for every election starting in 1972. And I like these because you can see how dynamic the voting ranges are. You know, it matters whether a candidate won by 2% or 20%. And a simple, blue versus red map just doesn't show those kinds of nuances. So I'll be using both types of maps going forward. But anyway, George McGovern was very much a New Deal Democrat in the style of FDR, big government. But however, in the 1960s and 70s, government had lost much of its appeal. Big government was not the asset that it had been in 1936. The 1960s were such a mess, and since Democrats had been in power for so long, it was really easy for voters to draw a line between big government and the problems of society. Similar to how they drew a line between small government and the mess of the Great Depression 40 years earlier. And additionally, lots of reports of government corruption, as well as violent abuse of Vietnamese people at the hands of the military were coming out during the late 60s and early 70s. And in addition to this, inflation rates and oil prices were skyrocketing during the 70s, both of which made everything in life more expensive, and also people had like brown carpets in their bathrooms. The 1970s was just a very bleak time for America, and so all of these things combined to make it so that people just didn't view government as favorably as they did in like 1936 when FDR was president, even though some of these things were actually not the result of government policy. In 1973, though, after Nixon won in a landslide in 1972, it was revealed that he had cheated during the lead up to the election. He had bugged the hotel room of some of the Democratic officials who were staying at the Watergate Hotel, and then totally 100% lied to clear it up, to cover it up. And it was a certainty that he would be impeached and then removed from office, and so he resigned in order to avoid being forced out by Congress. And this, remember, this was back when it was actually a really big deal for the president to cheat and then lie to cover it up. And so this further eroded people's faith in government. The president cheating and resigning. But Watergate is always very weird to me because, like I said, Nixon was up by like 20% in all the polls. He did not need to cheat in order to win. He was just very paranoid, though, and that ended up being his downfall. But because of this massive scandal, and I know we're very desensitized to scandals now because of the current occupant of the White House, as well as just the nature of the 24-hour news cycle. Everything becomes a huge deal. But in 1973, it was really a huge deal that the president of the United States cheated. as recently as 30 years before this, someone as dignified and universally respected as FDR was president. And so the country was truly shaken to its core that the president cheated to win an election and then lied to cover it up. But because of this, in 1976, the next election, Democrats, they saw an opening. And they nominated a guy named Jimmy Carter, who was the relatively moderate governor of Georgia and a simple peanut farmer who went on to become, I believe, the most adorable president we've ever had. But Jimmy Carter, he ended up winning the election in 1976 by a pretty small margin. And he won numerous states that had drifted away from Democrats in recent years. But he won them by very small margins, though. And so it wasn't exactly a comeback for the Democrats. And bless his heart, I really think Jimmy Carter tried to be a good president, but the late 1970s were not good. There was this thing called stagflation, which is it's a mix of high inflation and economic stagnation, and so it's not good. And U.S. citizens were also taken hostage during the Iranian Revolution and stayed over there for like a year. And there were also very stubbornly high oil prices, like I mentioned, and also, like I mentioned, brown carpets in bathrooms, and you know, again, just not a good time. And I think if Jimmy Carter had been president at a different point in time, he could have done a pretty good job. But God bless it if he just didn't meet the moment. And even though he is a very good person in his heart, I believe, he just didn't have the right spirit, the right energy that was needed in order to rally Americans during these times of crisis. And so in 1980, he ran for re-election against a guy named Ronald Reagan and lost big. Reagan was a very conservative Republican, though, which scared a lot of moderate Republicans. You can actually see in the margin of victory maps that there's a lot of light pink. A lot of northern Republicans and conservative former Democrats were really not sure about Reagan. But they had been so unhappy with Jimmy Carter that they just held their nose and voted for him. Reagan's election, though, this finished the conservative movement that had begun 16 years earlier with Barry Goldwater's landslide loss. Reagan, like Goldwater, he very much believed in limited government involvement, but he was also very socially conservative, which appealed to those disaffected white Southern voters. But so he came in and slashed tax rates, especially for the rich, and fired union workers as soon as he got into office, and so he set the tone for what his presidency would be. These tax cuts were centered around a school of thought called trickle-down economics, which posits that if rich people are given more and more money, that money will eventually trickle down to the middle and lower classes. It's kind of like having a dinner party and everyone's sitting at, a long table, and one side, all the food is on one side, and that side keeps being brought more and more and more food to the point where they're just stuffing themselves and can't even eat any more food. Eventually, some of the scraps and the crumbs will trickle their way down to the other side of the table, maybe even a whole turkey leg at one point. That's a logical approach to things, right? But coincidentally, around this time that Reagan slashed all these taxes, especially on the rich, the budget deficit and the debt began to skyrocket. And the difference between those two things is the deficit is the difference between the money we make and the money we spend every year. So if you have $100 and you spend $105, you have a $5 deficit. That $5 would then be added to the total debt that you as a person owe. And so the deficit is a yearly thing, and the debt is a running number. Reagan remained very popular, though, and he ran for re-election in 1984 against a guy named Walter Mondale, who had been Jimmy Carter's vice president. And much like George McGovern in 1972, you probably have not heard of Walter Mondale, and for very similar reasons. Like McGovern in 1972, Walter Mondale was a big government Democrat, and like McGovern in 1972, Walter Mondale lost 49 states in 1984. The only state he won was Minnesota, which he carried by 0.1%. You can see on that map, that on the margin map, that it was just a sea of dark red. And then this one, light blue. But so in 1988, after Reagan couldn't run anymore due to his term limits and brain problems, Republicans nominated his vice president, a guy named George H.W. Bush. And this is not the George Bush that we are all familiar with. This is his ultimately lesser-known father. We'll call him Bush 41, since he was the 41st president. And to put it mildly and simply, Bush just did not have the charisma of Ronald Reagan. And that same year, Democrats nominated a guy named Michael Dukakis, the governor of Massachusetts. And after 8 years of Reagan and 8 years of landslides, Democrats were very excited about the opportunity to finally take back the White House. Dukakis entered the fall of 1988 with a 15% lead in the polls, and so Democrats were optimistic. However, due to some campaign mistakes by Dukakis and some smart attack strategies of Bush 41, Dukakis ended up losing to Bush by 8 points, a pretty big margin. And in all fairness, he did improve upon Walter Mondale's 1984 performance, but in all fairness, that is a shockingly low bar. But so at this point, similar to Republicans after their 1948 loss, Democrats just took a long look in the mirror. They had lost 5 of the last 6 elections, one of which seemed extremely winnable just 4 months before it. And 2 of those losses were in 49 state landslides, and their only win was the moderate Southerner Jimmy Carter, who barely won. And because of this trend, in the lead up to the 1982 election, hardly any big-name Democrats wanted to run because Bush 41 seemed like such a guaranteed win. His approval rating was over 80%, and the 1991 Gulf War was largely viewed as a success, unlike later wars in Iraq. And so Bush 41 was just viewed as unbeatable. But then, out of the dark political wilderness came an unknown figure, a young, smooth-talking Southern Democratic governor named Bill Clinton, who I will discuss in my next video. So I hope you all learned at least one new thing from this video. Thank you all very much for watching. Have a great night.